All right. Hello, everybody. The Nameless Narcissist here once again. A simple man diagnosed with NPD, giving the facts on narcissistic personality disorder and things that go on in my head. If you like this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. But keep in mind, I am no clinician, so I can only speak to my own experiences. But the clinician can speak to actual research and being a professional. We have Anthony Bateman here today. He is a professor of a clinician that focuses in mentalization-based therapy and also treats people who are narcissistic like me. Do you want to give yourself a little introduction about what you're about?
Okay. Yeah. Hello, everybody. I'm Anthony Bateman. I'm a consultant to the Anna Freud Centre, which is in London for children and families, and also visiting professor at University College in London as well. And I spent much of my working life working with people with personality problems, personality difficulties, and particularly borderline personality disorder originally, and then using mentalization-based treatment, of which I was one of the developers with Peter Fonagy and a number of others.
So you did mention right there that you did focus on borderline personality disorder for a while. What did cause your pivot, so to speak, into narcissistic problems instead of borderline ones?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question because really when we started out, borderline personality disorder was the most sort of written about, and it was just really developing, to be honest, as a concept, as that sort of elision of interpersonal relationship problems with emotional regulation problems, with impulse problems, combining together. And John Gunderson and others sort of developed the concept and so on. So we started there with treatments, and that group, in a sense, were the commonest group in health services coming forward for treatment. But as time went on and we generated treatment, which was mentalization-based treatment, it became apparent that mentalizing is a core sort of component of personality functioning, which we all, and it's a developmental achievement overall. And so it became applied to other disorders, and we moved really to researching a group of people who actually received limited treatment, and this was really antisocial functioning. Okay, so those that were engaged in antisocial rather than pro-social behaviors came up against the criminal justice system and so on, and we generated a mentalizing approach to that group. And it was really that group that for me, brought home how narcissistic functioning goes across personality functioning and personality disorders. So in antisocial and borderline, there's also quite a lot of narcissism as well. Now, we know there's narcissistic personality disorder in these categories, but categories are not very good at describing people. People are complex, they've got different levels of function and so on. And the mind's a kind of mysterious place, so it operates in all sorts of funny ways. And narcissism and self, as it were, if we just take that for the moment, is very important in borderline, unstable experience of self, very important in antisocial, who have a rather fixed perspective around their self-experience. And then, of course, the sort of narcissism where there is a particular style of self-experience and so on. So we came through to narcissism through the antisocial, through working with antisocial personality.
That's interesting. So what I'm hearing is that because you're working with narcissists now, because narcissists are the borderlines of the equivalent of what borderlines were back then and stuff like that in terms of research and popularity, for lack of a better word.
Well, they become more popular, particularly in the US, yes. But interestingly, there's such limited research in narcissism. I mean, there's almost none.
Trust me, I know.
Yeah, which was really why they tried to, as it were, dispense with the term really in the DSM and narcissism. And you are aware there was a big sort of argument around that.
Yes. Are you familiar with how that all, do you know why the ulterior the alternative criteria got shot down at the last minute? I've always been curious.
Well, there are a number of reasons. I think people were concerned that the sudden shift was not incremental enough. It was too big a shift. And to get rid of all the sort of categorical sort of personality kind of diagnoses, as it were, I think was felt to be too big a single step, as it were, and it should be much more incremental. And there should be more research actually on the dimensional approach. And really, I think maybe it was just a bit early. There was a very strong argument, though, that people were very worried about the translation of research of borderline into the new dimensional system, how the research would all be, as it were, undermined, because it was no longer applicable to a new system. We wouldn't know who we're treating, as it were, or what evidence we had for it, and so on. Yeah. That was an issue. And they tried to dispense with narcissism, which upset a large number of clinicians who felt strongly that we see this in clinical practice. Even though there's no research on it, we see it. Yeah. So they were worried about that. And then thirdly, people got worried about private health systems, with no diagnoses, with just dimensional sort of descriptions and so on, would limit the amount of reimbursement for treatments and all these things. So it was a political problem, but also in part a research conceptual problem as well.
Interesting. That's fascinating. Like, that was me indulging my my little nerdiness right there. For people that don't know, the alternative criteria was a proposed model for diagnosing personality disorders that you can still find in the section 3 of the DSM. Personally, I'm not sure. I only am really familiar with the borderline and narcissistic one. I really like the one for narcissism. The borderline one seems a little weird, personally, but I don't know enough about it to make any definitive opinions on it. Anyways, instead of indulging my autistic fascination with the DSM, let's move on. I mentioned, could you give a little rundown of mentalization-based therapy, since that is what your expertise is in, and I'm sure it's going to keep being brought up throughout the course of this.
Yeah, well, mentalization-based treatment was actually predicated on the idea that mentalizing was a core dimension of personality functioning. So it's a higher dimensional process. So it really fits well with the alternative model, actually, because the alternative model contains a lot about self-identity, and relational functioning. And we think that mentalizing is the core dimension, as it were, that controls that manages self and interpersonal function. So MBT itself targets this capacity of the individual to mentalize, that is, to perceive about themselves and their self-experience, and to perceive the experiences of others, and to actually make sense of their behaviors of ourselves and others according to our reading of mind states.
Gotcha.
Okay. So you and I have to kind of spend our time in a dance. So I'm reading your mind, you read my mind, and we respond as a reciprocity. That's what we do in life, We walk along with someone and they experience a sense that we kind of know where they're coming from, and we experience a sense they're picking up where we're coming from. So we read minds, in essence. And when people behave in a certain way, we anticipate and make sense of it because there's a mind behind it. And we kind of, as it were, infer that mind. We imagine it, and so on. And we sometimes check it out and so on. So we operationalize these sort of mentalizing processes. And basically in MBT, we target mentalizing, but it's quite a structured treatment. So we have some discussion and education around mentalizing, what it is, how it applies in everyday life, and so on, how it's used to manage emotional states of ourselves, to regulate ourselves, self-soothing emotions, how we use it to read other people, and so on, and when it goes wrong, and those sorts of things. What happens to us when mentalizing is undermined, because if we get stressed, we can't think. We all know that. Okay, when you get really worked up and too emotional, you can't do anything.
Me always.
Yeah. No, but absolutely, it undermines mentalizing, so we can't really think straight at all. So we discuss with patients for the framework what things undermine them. They can't think straight, their mind goes offline, and so on. And so we define low mentalizing, what it looks like, and so on. So we do all this, and we know that mentalizing actually is built over time from infancy to adulthood within the attachment processes, within relationship processes in the family or with our caregivers and so on. So we want to look at relationships, we want to look at mentalizing and their interactive processes. So we create the framework in treatment, and then we simply engage in group and individual work with focusing on mentalizing. And we kind of get you to start reconsidering yourself, reflecting on yourself, for example. So
I was about to say, so far it sounds like a big portion of this is just self-reflection on how you perceive the world and how accurate that is.
Yeah, but you have to be doing it with someone rather than doing it just on your own. So in MBT, we have a very sort of equality system with a to and fro between you and the clinician, and trying to work each other's mind states out, where things are coming from, what they're like, and so on. So mind states become the focus. But it's not quite the same as, say, psychoanalysis, where it's solely the mind state of the individual internally, or cognitive therapy, where you might have very much the thought processes being appraised of the patient, of the client. In MBT, there's much more of a conversational partnership, trying to work things through that interactive process to understand better the individual's way of perceiving themselves and how they place themselves in the world, and then how they perceive the world with them.
So you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like not only is the therapist entering into the internal world of the patient, but the patient is also trying to do the same thing with the therapist.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's cool. I love that.
But you'll be doing that even if we didn't focus on it. I think as a patient, you do that. You're trying to work out your therapist. Who is this guy? What are they like? Can I trust in them? Because one thing we know, when we have low mentalizing generally, we actually have what's called distrust, epistemic distrust. We don't really know that we can learn from other people.
Gotcha.
Yeah, okay, because we can't read them right, so we can never really believe in them. They might be manipulating us. They could be trying to do things we don't like, all sorts of things. So we're distrustful in the world. And that's key to personality functioning when it's really not working.
Yeah. Wow. You may have just convinced me to get a new therapist, because that kind of therapy sounds right up my alley, actually.
I want to undermine your present therapist.
I won't tell her it was you, okay? Okay, but that's really cool. I'm glad I'm really glad that you're here now. But so I'm going to move on though, because we do have limited amounts of time. So I mentioned this to you a little bit earlier. What I call the business model of narcissism, where in society, narcissism has been sensationalized as a society-changing phenomena, and narcissism has become obviously more prevalent in society as well. And I personally have a lot of issues with how this has manifested, especially you can go on YouTube and find a billion channels about narcissistic abuse. And a lot of people making a lot, life coaches making money off of it and stuff. I would love to hear your thoughts on this newfound phenomenon regarding the pathology.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, it's not quite my area of expertise in such a sort of general and cultural question, but I mean, there are some things about it which are quite interesting. I would say that, to what degree these things become, as you like, increase in their prevalence, as it were, or their use within the society, and some of that has to do with sort of social fragmentation, whether or not there's a change over time where the individual in their own right has become increasingly the sort of focus, really, and the sort of social bonds that hold us together as larger, wider groups have somehow been loosened. And as such, in a way, we no longer have the sort of shared value system with a wide range of others that we can trust in, which give us a sort of sense of self-security. So if we then get a sort of problems with self-uncertainty, that what do we do about it? Well, we try to build it, I suppose. So in that sense, I might go to a coach who gets me to be a good male. I look good and I'm, my muscular, whatever. Or I'm much more reliant for my self-esteem on that sort of thing than I am on just my bonding with a social world. I'm not sure whether that makes sense, but I'm sort of making it up. But you do find that you increase the income gap from the top to the bottom in society does correlate quite well with the level of borderline personality functioning and so on. So you get fewer, as it were, generally speaking, where the sort of income gap is much narrower. So you've got, in a way, a fairer society and those sorts of things. And I just wonder if narcissism is not coming out of that somewhere.
I can see the possibility for sure.
Yeah. And then if people have that sort of need, then people are going to try and take that opportunity, aren't they? So you get lots of life coaches, or you get lots of gym coaches, or
because I guess I was just fascinating. I love that you touched on that. But I guess I was referring to the what's it called? Some of the people who will make money off of validating people being like, you were abused by a narcissist. This content is about helping you get through that. And also maybe you should buy my book and stuff like that. you know what I'm referring to?
Yeah. Yes. In the sense, I'm not quite sure what you mean by, I complain I was abused by a narcissist, or this is an explanation for something.
Yes, more or less. Like they, because there is a very big, especially online culture that is, I would say, I don't think demonizing is even, I think demonizing is a fair way to put it. They make narcissists out to be, a boogeyman. And
I see. Oh, I think this is quite wrong. I mean, it may be quite right, obviously, in the occasional
yes.
sort of person, that actually online or stalker or something like that, as a narcissistic personality, and possibly psychopathic sort of components as well.
Yeah.
But I think these are relatively uncommon. And I think it misses something really important, which is that, in a sense, narcissism actually goes through all of us to a degree. And we're talking here about the extent, in a way. And the vast majority of people struggling with narcissistic problems are not this level of sort of demons who are, have to be kept away from. They're actually people struggling with their self-esteem in some ways, but are managing it in a particular way. And as such, they're vulnerable, as well as maybe a pain in the neck some of the time, sort of thing, but that's the common. It's not someone who's dangerous and highly manipulative and so on, particularly. And that's why I say narcissism goes across personality. In antisocial, they may have antisocial actions, but they also have a very self-protection through some narcissistic functioning. Even avoidant people, you find, have very strong narcissistic elements sometimes.
Oh yeah,
but they're causing them trouble.
Similarly, it's also I would call it a self-esteem disorder with avoidant too, because they're so worried what people are thinking about them and everything.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So narcissism goes across this, and I think people should see it as sometimes coalescing into something which dominates the whole personality structure, but it doesn't go on to necessarily be a demon and a wicked abuser. No, definitely not.
I love that. That's the answer I'm always hoping to hear when I talk to professionals, because I'm always because that's the thing I'm trying to fight people the most on, is that, hey, yes, people with extreme pathologies can be abusive, hands down, but
Sure.
it's not this overwhelming majority who are mustache twirling villains.
Yeah.
I love that. Okay, so and that's something I find that's actually a question, and this is more on the vague side, but I would say like with the prevalence of narcissism increasing, do you think it's a prevalence of narcissism increasing or just self-absorption?
I can't answer that, but I mean, because there's lots of reasons why the prevalence of something might be changing, just because we're measuring it differently, for example, or something, but and things like that. And I'm not sure narcissism is just about self-absorption. I mean, necessarily. It can also be about actually having a sense that others need to understand me in a certain way and things like that. So you're trying to get others to think around you in a certain way. Maybe that's self-absorption, but it wouldn't be how I would define self-absorption. So I think...
Because I think they get mistaken for each other a lot. Like when people call children narcissistic, I would call that more self-absorbed rather than narcissistic. Does that make sense?
Yes, I would say so. I mean, I could be quite self-absorbed as a person who, because actually I'm rather introverted and so on, rather than just narcissistic and so on. Narcissists have got a much wider relational process, I think, rather than self-absorption.
I agree. Love that. This is great so far, by the way. I've been loving every second of this. So
you're a flattering narcissist, you see. So
Oh my gosh. Okay, so I would love to hear what your opinion is on the distinguish. Oh, actually, very briefly, I actually read a few studies on the pathology around stalking. Are you familiar with any of that research?
No, I'm not. I do know some of my colleagues look around, work on stalking, but I haven't done, no.
Gotcha. I was just kind of curious because I read a couple studies way back when, and it was basically the takeaway was the people with personality issues that were stalkers had strong narcissistic traits, but also a crock pot of other issues. So I was wondering if you knew anything more on that, because I skimmed through some research. But anyways, so I would love to hear what you think the distinguishing factor between NPD, BPD, and ASPD is. Like, how would you tell these apart?
Yes. Can I just come to that in a minute? Just stalking.
Oh,
I think just one principle, though, that we take in MBT and mentalizing is stalking is a behavior, isn't it? I mean, in a sense. Okay. What we're interested in is the mind behind that behavior.
yes.
So we wouldn't say, well, all stalkers are narcissists, if you see what I mean. This is a behavior. Then actually what's behind that needs that very careful thinking around. And I'd hate it if people sort of thought, well, all stalkers are narcissists and all narcissists are stalkers. This is clearly wrong.
Black and white thinking.
Yeah, exactly. All or nothing type stuff. Yeah. Yeah.
I do love that emphasis on the internal experience as opposed to behaviors. I mean, hell, that's the reason I have an issue with the DSM criteria right now, is because like all that is behaviors. How can you actually accurately diagnose anybody based off behaviors when how a narcissistic personality structure would present is going to be different literally every person? You meet me on the street, I'm not some dude who's going around like being arrogant as shit, like cutting lines and stuff because I'm entitled. Like that. The idea of cutting a line in public is like mind-blowing. I would never fucking do that. But that's the kind of person that you imagine when you think of a pathological narcissist.
Yes.
But yes, I'd still love to hear the difference between the way to distinguish NPD, BPD, and ASPD. Because honestly,
well, again, you're left with that problem, if I can just interrupt, with that same problem of categories. So you're then saying, look, they've got these three things, a ball, and a ball, but how do you distinguish them, sort of thing? I said, well, hang on a minute, they're all balls, you know, so we have to go into more detail. So in a sense, one of the problems is you could have narcissistic, borderline, and antisocial personality structure, as you called it. You could have elements of all of them. Now, I quite accept that actually, though, there are certain things that are probably different a little bit. So, for example, in borderline, if we just take that, let's just take the experiential self. In borderline functioning, it tends to be unstable. That's in the literature. A sort of sense, I don't know quite who I am. I'm not sure what I feel. I'm just not quite sure where I am, and so on. I'm not sure who I am when I'm in a relationship, this sort of sense. In antisocial, they tend to actually know who they are in the relationship, but they don't care about the other person in the relationship. The other person is supposed to behave in a certain way towards them and be like this. And that's where it begins to overlap with narcissism. So this experience of self is very often quite stable in a way in antisocial and narcissistic personality. You know, the core experiential self moves across time in the same way, which it doesn't in borderline function. So in borderline, I don't know who I was yesterday. I might know who I sort of am today, but I can't predict I'm going to be the same one tomorrow. In antisocial and narcissism to some degree, this is who I am. But it's quite sometimes narrow and rather fixed and rather rigid in its stability. So it doesn't have a lot of fluctuation and so on.
Do you have you observed, and because I call it self-esteem juice, when a narcissist isn't getting that affirmation that they need, have you observed they turn into more borderline-esque, not knowing who they are when they aren't getting their self-esteem needs met?
If I understood your question properly, you think when the narcissistic functioning individual doesn't get their needs met, they can become less stable in themselves. Is that your...
And more borderline presenting almost.
Yeah, they might do. You know, in a way, what you're putting forward, which I think I would agree with, is that in much of the narcissism that we see, the individual is quite vulnerable inside. So however much they may present as being confident, their self-esteem's high, their self-opinion is positive and so on, or affirmative, that there is also a vulnerability. And and that vulnerability may be activated if other people don't keep them fueled, as it were, with the affirmation, let's say. I think. And then you're suggesting that some of them may become really quite unstable and uncertain. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. The thing that worries me in narcissism when it's a very strong function is that if that vulnerability actually is incredibly a painful vulnerability at its core, it can be utterly devastating. You know, it's really serious. It's really severe. And I think sometimes that individual can think they can never recover from it, and that's a real danger point.
It's the lack of emotional permanence or whatever. I mean, I remember there's been times in my life where I have fell into lows like that, and it just feels like, I always say I feel like a borderline at that point. I get like almost I can't even think of a way to put it. I get very despondent and think I'm never going to get out of it. Basically.
Yeah, but if you, as it were, call it, you feel like a borderline, I'm interested in that, because in a way, in borderline functioning, that you might at that point then, as it were, interface with the world and try and get it to do something to help you feel better. So they can be very directed to, you know, the health system, or they call people, or they panic and so on. Now, in a sense, that's the survival system for that state of mind.
Yeah.
you've got to do something, you guys. But my worry in the narcissism is that they actually don't have that. The panic doesn't lead them to actually relate and get some help. They actually sort of fall into themselves further.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of self-isolation usually is how it presents in me. And during my worst one, it was like when I became like quasi-suicidal, and that was preferable to humiliating myself by reaching out for help and stuff like that, because that became a method for me to regulate my self-esteem. But at least I can I can be in control if I unalive myself. Yeah. Which is, I do think now, like, I'm really glad you pointed that out, because that actually, I might make a fucking video on that, because that's a fascinating way of putting it, is that we're the borderline in states like that, we'll go out and seek help. The narcissist will still fall into trying to regulate the self-esteem, just in a little bit more destructive ways.
Yeah, well, I think that's it's an interesting sort of suggestion, really, which I think fits with the differences a little bit. But of course, these are only kind of they're not, well, if you do that, you're borderline. If you do that, you're narcissism. But you know about how it operates. But that may be one area that is worth thinking about.
And you'll notice through the course of this, I do have I have almost even though I don't like categorical models, I do have a categorical conception of a lot of these disorders in my head, mainly just because, like, when I met another narcissist for the first time, I was like, whoa, this is scary similar. And like, so I fall into the categorical stuff a lot.
Yeah.
So what's another? Oh, so for people who, because I mentioned I have a lot of clinicians that do watch my content. Do you have this is a broad question, but what kind of advice would you have for them in treating narcissistic patients? And like, what would you say is the biggest roadblock you have while doing that?
The roadblock to what? Sorry.
For treatment.
For treatment.
Yes.
I think the commonest roadblock, in a way, is for the individual has to begin to recognize that they've got some sort of central pain problem. Because in a way, for everybody, going to the psychologist, psychiatrist, the therapist is potentially, as it were, experienced as a humiliation. You know, and if I'm someone who actually has a very strong protected self of competence, say, and ability and so on, the idea to going to ask someone for something is really problematic and potentially humiliating. And in that humiliation, that can, of course, sort of activate a certain sense of failure or shame about things and so on. So, for example, we have real problems with the antisocial narcissistic functioning clients who come and they've got backgrounds of terrible trauma. But you ask them about it and they say, oh, that's not a problem. I got over that years ago. No, not a problem. And you say, well, you know, just tell me. Said, that doesn't have any effect on me now. You know, they have this very strong sort of sense that actually it's all overcome, it's all done for, it's got nothing to do with the difficulty now. And, you know, in a sense, maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong, but they're unable to actually, as it were, link to it or and so on. And they have a rather grand sense that their whole mind has overcome these problems. So I think actually beginning to accept that actually you might need someone else to help you reconsider yourself, not just to see you how you want to be considered, is really the big sort of hump to get over.
Just even the way that you phrase, like, oh, I got over that years ago and stuff like that. I was like, whew, that sounded like me when I was 21. Jesus Christ. Like it's like, what, your dad tried to kill you when you were 17? That's awful. Like, that's nothing. What are you talking about? Oh my God, that's funny. No, that's interesting. Okay, and so this is something interesting, because obviously I kind of know the answer to this question, generally speaking, and obviously it's going to be different with most people. But do you think that most of these people who are narcissistically inclined, do you think that they do to some degree know that they are suffering and they just don't want to admit it? Or do you think they're genuinely deluded in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question in a way. I suppose my sense is that they touch their personal suffering, but actually recoil from it as fast as possible. And then they have ways of managing themselves in their world, which keeps them outside that suffering. So in a way, it sort of protects what we call in MBT, in a way, protects the self, which we call in this sense is I mode. This is an experiential I that we carry across time. I am this, I'm that, I was this yesterday, I am this next week, and so on. It's quite stable. And it's what we generate during our childhood and early adulthood. And in a sense, they've done that, and it's highly protected. And so they then begin to form relationships, potentially place themselves in the world where they get matching all the time. And that, of course, saves them, in a sense, from being a fractured I. Okay, so they may have, as it were, tried to create this I, which is stable, and actually create, though it's only a partial one in a sense. So the fractures are really there, they're papered over, but they're partly papered over by the matching system. Okay, so Kohut talked about this, and lots of other people have talked about it in different ways. Okay, and then that system is holds them in a way. So they have relationships, but they're a particular line and restricted relationships in some sense. And as a result, when we're having relationships and we're with people, in mentalizing terms, when it's intimate and working well and constructive, we call it we mode. But for narcissism, this we mode, what looks like we mode, actually isn't. It's a protected I mode. It doesn't have the mutuality as we mode might have, if you see what I mean. It may have some, but not as much as it seems.
You phrased it beautifully. I love that. Yeah, and like I'm to feed your narcissism a little bit. I think you have had some of the best ways of describing the experience and the how narcissists present and stuff like that. You've been doing very, very well at that. I have sometimes you'll say things like, shit, that's too right. I hate that. Oh my God, that's funny. Okay, so something that we touched on very briefly that I like to talk about quite a bit is how do you observe the fluctuations between the grandiosity and the vulnerability in your narcissistic patients? Because how I observe it in myself, at least, I can flip-flop between those states like several times a day even.
Right.
I would love to hear your observations about that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, here I have to mention my colleagues who really developed mentalizing around narcissism and the thinking of it. And that's Bob Drozek and Brandon Unruh in McLean in Harvard. And, you know, I've worked with them, but these ideas have come mainly from them. One thing we're quite keen on in mentalizing an MBT, it tries to be quite an empathically validating, compassionate treatment. And one thing we think in narcissism, between the grandiosity and vulnerability, is while we always, as therapists, always trying to get rid of the grandiosity, you know, show the vulnerability sort of thing. Hang on a minute. So we sort of hang on a minute, and we're quite keen that the grandiosity itself should be, as it were, held and looked at and appreciated in its own right. So, you know, there may be exaggerations, there may be all sorts of functions that it's got, but actually it's not necessarily something that has to be sort of completely undermined. So we actually, first off in MBT, try to, as it were, validate and get hold of what we're calling shorthand grandiosity. But it's protecting the self-esteem, it's protecting the self-confidence, it's protecting an I, and therefore has to be, as it were, nurtured and held. And so we're very keen on that. And the vulnerability, you touch on and so on, but you can only touch on the vulnerability and build on that to see how the vulnerability is actually, as it were, within the fracture of the I. So seeing myself in certain ways that don't match how I experience myself, or being seen as something that I don't match with something as I see myself, creates a terrible tension. And so the vulnerabilities actually need to be integrated. Do you see what I mean? Into the grandiosity, if you like, so the thing becomes more coherent.
That's, oh my God. I'm so happy you said that. You have no idea how validated I feel right now, because I literally, and like I get some pushback on this quite a bit, where I talk about, I'm like, well, people don't want us to be grandiose. They don't want us to self-aggrandize. There's a association with bad, with grandiosity. And I'm like, would you prefer us just to be miserable wrecks all the time? I think the grandiosity can be managed instead of just completely destroyed, right? And I've had friends who like have pointed it out, like when I'm being grandiose and basically being like, oh, that's bad, stop doing that, more or less. Once they knew what my pathology was, at the very least. And I think that misses the point of this defense mechanism. You know what I mean? Why tear down something so that I have no defenses against the horror of the internal emptiness? But yeah, I feel very, very validated that you said that. Thank you for feeding my narcissism.
Yeah, but in a way, we would think in mentalizing terms that core emptiness you just mentioned, I mean, that's a pretty frightening statement when you get down to it, isn't it? And in a sense, that emptiness, I think, actually is filled, if you like, or disappears if you integrate the vulnerability with the grandiosity. So you're not trying to get rid of one or the other. You're actually trying to get an integration.
They're both parts of the patient.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, there shouldn't be. I think if you're a therapist and trying to destroy a part of a patient, that seems a little messed up if you think about it. Yeah. That's funny. I love that. That's great. So my next question. By the way, how long have we been going so far?
Probably 45 minutes or more, 50 minutes.
So, yeah. Okay, we'll be wrapping up then. I have one more question. Then at the end, I want to ask if there's anything you want to talk about. What would you say the biggest misconception about pathological narcissism is?
Gosh, I don't know what the misconception, but I think
it's like everything, right?
Well, I mean, it can be used in lots of different ways. I think in very often it's used, as people point out, about your colleagues who are being problematic or difficult or something like that. But we can use it to dismiss people, for example, and so
it's the asshole disorder.
Yeah, that's right, exactly. You know, I think that happens quite a lot. But I think the misconception is that they don't care about anything other than themselves. They do care about themselves, yes. So I care about myself, and so we all, I hope, do care about ourselves. But actually, they do care about others, and they care about how others see them, of course. But actually, there's a kind of very strong sense in narcissism where actually they're uncomfortable when with others, and that actually they want to be comfortable. Do you see what I mean? They're not avoidant. They're not keeping out of all relationships. They're trapped in a rather narrow format, in a sense.
I agree. That's again, you're phrasing things really well. It's from my perspective and personal experience, how I always have described it is like, I want people to see me for who I am, but I'm also terrified of them seeing me for who I am. Mm-hmm. And so I'll, even despite like, and I almost want them to kind of rip off the mask, so to speak, but then I'll fight it tooth and nail every step of the way. Yeah. Which is, yeah, it's always been, which is an interesting experience, I'll say.
Yeah. But you see, it's only if they strip it off and see you as you are and so on, and you feel that you actually feel you're with someone. So I think to some degree, we mustn't miss the fact that in narcissistic functioning, when it's very dominant, and it's pathological narcissism, is a very lonely living in a way.
That's one of my first. That's like the second symptom that I consciously recognized. Honestly, I as young as I was 17 when I first brought it up. I think I remember talking to one of my friends and telling them like that, like, and this was like the first time I was like ever vulnerable with somebody where I was like, I am lonely all the time, and they were like, you have more friends than anybody I know, and I was like, yeah, but I'm still lonely. I don't know how. I almost didn't understand how that was related. And ironically, him admitting that he didn't understand it made me feel more understood than I usually would, because it feels so invalidating when somebody is like, oh yeah, everybody goes through that. Oh, like, you know, I think you get what I mean. Anyways, so I would say we're about done because I don't want this to go on for 2 hours. We could fucking be talking about this all day. There's so much to go over. But is there anything you would like to bring up that you feel like is important that we haven't touched on yet for the end of the video?
No, I'm quite tired in trying to think quickly in terms of answering your questions, which are quite sharp and problematic and.
Problematic. That's a good way to describe me. Problematic. Oh, that's funny.
No, it's a very fascinating area, and I think it's great that people have become much more interested in how we function and in our narcissism, in our antisocial behavior sort of systems, in our borderline functioning and so on. The idea now that people are really interested in it is wonderful to me, because 30 years ago, people were not interested.
Not even talking about it at all. And hell, I think it's, well, and like, I think what has helped my empathy, so to speak, the most is my fascination in the internal experience of others. And I think that moving forward towards learning about personality disorders is a great way to be able to realize that we all do have different mentalization, so to speak. And I think that as a whole for society helps people connect a lot better than they would otherwise, which I think is a pretty damn cool thing. Like especially with my YouTube channel, we all the time, because it's so focused on like my internal experience, are all explaining to each other how we experience the world. And hell, I learned so much about how normal people, in quotes, experience the world that I would have never even considered if it weren't for this experience. But yeah, so I think that about wraps it up though. So that's this has been awesome, by the way. Thank you so much for doing this.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me on. I'm happy to do it.
Course. And I will do my little outro really quick. I hope you find this funny. All right. Thank you, everybody. Like, comment, and subscribe. And take your fucking meds, please. And that's the end.
Okay. Thanks very much.
Awesome.